After sending his mother to a nursing home, the son went to request a signature for the sale of the house. When he arrived at the nursing home, he was in for a big surprise. In a world that races forward at an unforgiving pace, where days seem to evaporate like dewdrops under the morning sun, we rarely find a moment to pause and reflect on the past. Life, in its relentless flow, occasionally grants us pauses, moments where it seems to slow down, gliding along like a movie in slow motion. In those instances, Margaret's mind traveled back in time, recalling with striking clarity the golden days of her youth. I see my son then, a mischievous little boy running barefoot through the garden, his laughter resonating like music to my ears. It seems like it was just yesterday, she mused, a memory so vivid I can almost hear the echo of his giggles in the air. Then, as if in the blink of an eye, came the time when I brought my grandchildren to that same garden, a place that had witnessed so many changes and joys. Margaret, her silver hair shining under the sun, eagerly awaited the arrival of spring each year with almost childlike anticipation. For her, the garden was not just a piece of land, it was a living canvas, a space where she unleashed her creativity and passion. Her hands, though wrinkled with the passage of time, were skilled and steady, dancing among flowers and green leaves in perfect harmony with nature. With the arrival of the harvest season, it was a magical sight. The family, spanning generations, gathered to enjoy this annual miracle. "Look at the first tomatoes," exclaimed her youngest grandchild, his eyes as large and bright as the red jewels he held in his hands. Margaret, her face lit up with a radiant smile, delighted in sharing the fruits of her hard work. "Take these, my children. This is from the land that nourishes us," she would say, carefully filling their bags with crisp vegetables and juicy fruits. Her generosity knew no bounds. For her, sharing the harvest with her family was an act of love, a way to nourish not just their bodies but also their souls. In those moments, the garden became a gathering place, a space where laughter and conversations filled the air, intertwining with the buzzing of bees and the songs of birds. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, allowing them to appreciate the beauty of simplicity and what truly mattered in life. As time passed, it brought with it imperceptible but inevitable changes in Margaret's life. The garden, once filled with the laughter and playful footsteps of her grandchildren, began to sink into a silence that weighed heavily in the air. The visits, once frequent and joyful, had become sporadic and gradually almost ceased entirely. Margaret felt her life had entered a sort of suspension, as if she were in a state of perpetual waiting, counting the days until the next summer, hoping to reunite her family once more. The garden, a reflection of her heart, also underwent this change. The strawberries, once abundant and juicy, ripened each year in smaller quantities. Where there were once rows of potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, and cucumbers, now only a few solitary plants grew. Margaret, with trembling hands and a body weakened by illness, could no longer tend to her garden with the same vigor and dedication as before. One day, while picking a few strawberries, Margaret paused and sat on an old wooden bench, gazing around her garden. With a sigh, she wondered aloud, "When was the last time I filled a bucket with fruits and vegetables for my grandchildren?" Her words drifted away on the breeze. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she realized that those days might be gone forever. Margaret, an 82-year-old woman, lived alone in a small village, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Despite the challenges, she never considered moving. She felt proud of her son, who had found success and happiness in the city, although he hadn't forgotten her and used to visit with his family. Those visits were now rare. One day, hoping to see them soon, she called her son. "When will you come to see me, son?" she asked, trying to conceal her anxiety. His response was like a blow to her heart. "Mum, maybe it's better if we buy you something. It doesn't make much sense for me to travel so far if there's nothing to harvest in the garden," he suggested. Margaret felt his words shatter something inside her. The garden that once symbolized family unity and joy had become an excuse for distance. At that moment, Margaret realized that not only her garden, but also her relationship with her family needed care and attention. Perhaps it was time to accept that the seasons of life change, just like gardens do, each bringing its own challenges and beauties. With a heavy heart, she rose from the bench, wiped away her tears, and decided that, although her garden was no longer what it once was, she could still cultivate hope and love in her life. Sitting in her favorite rocking chair, Margaret often lost herself in thought, trying to find solace in understanding that life is a mosaic of difficulties and joys. She knew her son John, caught up in the whirlwind of his own life, faced daily challenges in the city. "Everyone has their battles to fight," she murmured to herself, trying to justify John's sporadic calls, which seemed more like fulfilling a duty than a genuine desire to communicate with her. Over time, Margaret began to notice her vision blurring, the colors of the garden fading into a grey veil. One day, while she was in the garden, little Lily, her neighbor's granddaughter, approached her with an innocent smile. "Grandma Margaret, let me help you with the strawberries," said Lily, running towards the bushes. Margaret sat on the nearby bench, listening to the sounds of Lily picking strawberries. When Lily handed her the small bowl with just a few strawberries, Margaret could barely discern what was inside. "Thank you, my dear," she said with a trembling voice, realizing it was time to seek medical help and possibly new glasses. A few days later, while walking down the garden path, Margaret stumbled over a stone hidden in the shadows. Her fall was abrupt, and for a moment the world faded into darkness. She lay there, the cool earth pressing against her skin, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. It was Lily who found her and ran to get help, her small voice piercing the air with urgency. Margaret was taken to the hospital, and it was there, lying in a stark white room, that she understood the full extent of her isolation. Reflecting on her life, Margaret realized that just as gardens need constant care, so do relationships. She resolved to reach out more, to not let the physical distance become an emotional chasm. As she recovered, she made plans to visit her son in the city, hoping to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Her garden, once a place of vibrant life and color, might have faded, but her spirit, reinvigorated by the prospect of rekindling family bonds, remained unbroken. With renewed determination, Margaret began to see her life not as a series of fading memories, but as an ongoing journey, where every moment held the potential for new beginnings and renewed connections. The seasons might change and gardens might wither, but the love and effort she put into her family would always have the chance to bloom again. Upon regaining consciousness, Margaret found herself on the ground with her neighbor by her side, concern and relief evident on her face. "Margaret, you need to see a doctor. This could have been much worse," insisted the neighbor, helping her to her feet. Moved by her neighbor's concern, Margaret nodded silently. Later, when John received the call about the incident, his usually distant tone was replaced by an urgency Margaret hadn't heard in years. "Mama, this can't continue. You need medical attention. I insist you come to the city and see a specialist," John said firmly. Although surprised by John's sudden involvement, Margaret felt a mix of relief and apprehension. On one hand, she was worried about her health and the possibility of a change in her peaceful life. On the other, she hoped this incident could be an opportunity to reconnect with her son, to share more than brief conversations and obligatory visits. "Thank you, John. Perhaps it's time we see more of each other," Margaret responded, a thread of hope weaving through her voice. In her heart, she knew that despite the years and the distance, the bond between mother and son could still be strengthened. This unexpected turn of events might just be the start of a new chapter in their relationship. The decision to take Margaret to the doctor marked the beginning of a new phase in her life and in her relationship with John. The first stop was the ophthalmologist's office, where it was revealed that although her vision wasn't severely impaired, she needed glasses to improve her sight. Watching his mother while the doctor conducted tests, John couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. "Why didn't I notice this sooner?" he wondered. "Mama, it's important that we get you a full checkup," John suggested as they left the ophthalmologist's office. Margaret, used to being self-sufficient and not wanting to be a burden, initially resisted. "I don't want to worry you, John. You've already done so much for me," she replied, with a forced smile. But John insisted, knowing that his mother's care shouldn't be limited to occasional calls or sporadic visits. "Mama, this is the least I can do. I want to make sure you're okay," he said firmly. Thus began a series of visits to various specialists. During the examinations, several health issues requiring attention were discovered, including blood pressure problems and early signs of arthritis. John was taken aback, realizing that his mother had been enduring these ailments in silence, without complaining or seeking help. Each doctor's visit became an opportunity for John and Margaret to reconnect. In the waiting rooms, amid worn-out magazines and the murmur of other patients, they shared conversations that had been postponed for years. They talked about the garden, John's childhood memories, and, gradually, about their hopes and fears. Despite her initial resistance, Margaret began to cherish these moments. "I guess I needed a checkup just to spend more time with you, son," she often joked. For his part, John, immersed in his mother's world, started to understand the complexities of her life in the village. He recognized the challenges Margaret faced daily, from loneliness to the difficulty of accessing adequate health care. This realization made him question whether he had been too absorbed in his own life, neglecting his mother's needs. As they continued their medical visits, John's perspective shifted. He began to appreciate the strength and resilience his mother had shown over the years. These trips to the doctor were not just about addressing Margaret's health issues. They became a journey of rediscovery and bonding. They brought them closer, helping John see his mother not just as an aging parent, but as a person with her own struggles and triumphs. Through this process, John resolved to be more present in his mother's life. He understood that nurturing their relationship was as important as taking care of her physical health. With renewed commitment, John promised himself that he would make the effort to bridge the gap that had grown between them, ensuring that the remaining years they had together would be filled with love, understanding, and shared moments. In the end, it wasn't just Margaret who needed healing. It was their relationship that needed nurturing. And through these unexpected events, both mother and son found a path to reconnect, realizing that every moment spent together was a precious gift, worth cherishing and holding on to. The decision regarding Margaret's future care sparked an emotional dilemma in John's household. One evening, after a series of medical visits, John sat down in the living room with his wife Susan and broached the subject delicately. "Susan, I've been thinking. Maybe Mom should stay with us during her treatment. It would be easier for both her and me," he suggested, his voice laden with concern. Susan, wearing a worried expression, quickly responded, "John, I understand your feelings, but have you thought about the implications? Her health could deteriorate if she doesn't receive the right care here. Plus, with our jobs and the kids, who will look after her during the day? She argued, trying to be practical, but also showing her concern for the situation. The conversation was tense but necessary. John, torn between the desire to be close to his mother and the reality of his family life, found himself at a crossroads. Susan, on her part, tried to maintain balance in their already busy household, fearing that Margaret's presence could disrupt their daily routine. Eventually, Susan proposed an alternative solution. "How about we find a good nursing home? It might be the best option for everyone, especially for your mother. She would have professionals caring for her around the clock," she suggested, with a tone that mixed compassion with firmness. John reluctantly agreed. "Maybe you're right, Susan. It's a tough decision. But we want what's best for Mom," he said, feeling a heaviness in his heart. Meanwhile, in the dim light of her room, Margaret listened to their conversation. Despite her deteriorating eyesight, her sharp hearing caught every word. Emotions overwhelmed her as she recalled the past years, the effort and love she had poured into raising John. Alongside her late husband, she had worked tirelessly to create a home full of love and security for her son. "We did everything we could for him without asking for anything in return," she thought, feeling a pang in her heart. Lying in her bed, memories of a life dedicated to her family floated through her mind. Susan's proposal of sending her to a nursing home echoed in her ears, leading her to reflect on the inevitable passage of time and the changes in family dynamics. "Maybe it's for the best," she whispered to herself, trying to find solace in the idea that her son still wanted the best for her, even though the circumstances had changed. That night, Margaret fell asleep with a mix of feelings: a deep love for her son, the acceptance of her new reality, and a sense of loss for the times that would never return. In her heart, she knew the decisions being made were not easy for anyone, and this provided her with a small measure of comfort. In the quiet of her room, Margaret pondered over the complexities of family relationships she had experienced over the years. She had always maintained an attitude of respect and understanding towards Susan, her daughter-in-law, despite not always receiving the same treatment in return. "Susan is different," she would often tell herself, "but she's John's wife, and she deserves my respect." This philosophy had guided her even through the most challenging times, keeping harmony within the family. With her grandchildren, the situation was similar. Margaret adored them and was always ready to help, whether it was babysitting or assisting with schoolwork. Despite her efforts, she felt that in recent times she had become more of a spectator than an active participant in their lives. "I would never have let problems drive me away from my family." She recalled how, alongside her late husband, she had faced challenges without ever considering giving up or abandoning ship. "We supported each other, no matter what," she murmured. Yet now she perceived a shift in mentality. The sense that times had changed was palpable. Today's children, she reflected, seem to see things differently. The idea that parents, once no longer deemed useful, become expendable, deeply disturbed her. This notion was foreign to her understanding of life and family. This sad realization led her to a painful yet considered decision. "I don't want to be a burden to them," she thought. "John has his own life, and Susan, well, she has her opinions." With strength, Margaret decided to move to a nursing home. She wanted to make life easier for her son and his family, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort and the familiarity of her home. The soft dawn light filtered through the curtains, bathing the kitchen in golden hues as Margaret prepared breakfast. It was a morning like any other, but for her it carried the weight of a momentous decision. With steaming coffee on the table, she waited for John and Susan to join her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the emotion of what she was about to share. When John and Susan entered the kitchen, Margaret took a deep breath and announced with a voice that tried to be cheerful, "I've decided to move to a nursing home. I think I'll be happier among people my age, and I won't be a burden to you." Her smile was forced, trying to hide the sadness nesting in her heart. John and Susan exchanged quick, relieved glances. Although each had their reasons for feeling this way, neither wanted to openly express their relief. John, struggling with his own feelings of guilt and relief, responded carefully. "If that's what you want, Mum will support you. We want you to be happy." Susan, on her part, tried to show concern. "It will be good for you, Margaret. At the nursing home, you'll receive the care you need, and you'll be surrounded by people who share your interests," she said, attempting to convince both Margaret and herself that this was the best decision. The decision was made, and though Margaret's heart was heavy, she also felt a strange sense of relief. She had made a difficult choice for the well-being of her family, maintaining the dignity and unconditional love that had always characterized her life. However, Margaret's disappointment was palpable. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that her son would oppose the idea, insisting she stay. The ease with which they had accepted her decision left her feeling abandoned. "I thought maybe," Margaret began, her voice breaking slightly. "But I understand. It's best for everyone." The conversation continued with the practical details of the move, but for Margaret, it felt as though she was not just saying goodbye to her home, but also to a role she had played her entire life, as a mother and grandmother at the heart of the family. It felt like she was closing an important chapter, one filled with love, sacrifice, and dedication. As John and Susan talked about logistics, Margaret got lost in her thoughts, recalling the happy moments and the challenges overcome. Now, at the end of that journey, she faced the reality of old age and the shift in family dynamics. Although her decision was logical, she couldn't help but feel deep sorrow for the loss of her place in the home she had built with so much love. The decision to move to the nursing home had been complex for Margaret, and the speed with which Susan had found the place added a layer of uncertainty and suspicion. In her heart, Margaret felt that the choice of the nursing home had been more convenient for Susan than considered for her well-being. Susan says she knows the place, but how well can she really know it? Margaret pondered quietly as she packed some belongings. Despite her reservations, Margaret chose not to argue. She wanted to avoid any conflict that could increase tension in the family. "Maybe it's for the best," she told herself, trying to convince herself. She asked to bring her most cherished items, those that reminded her of home and her past life, like photographs, her favorite knitted blanket, and some books. In the days leading up to her departure, Margaret made an effort to keep the atmosphere cheerful. She wanted her family to remember a home filled with love and happiness, not sadness and farewells. Come on, no long faces. This is a new adventure for me," she said with a forced smile as she organized a small farewell party. The move was executed with Susan's characteristic efficiency. Margaret watched as her life was packed into boxes, feeling a mixture of nostalgia and resignation. Upon arriving at the nursing home, both she and her family were met with a reality different from what they had expected. The place was run down, and the facilities clearly needed renovation. Susan, who had praised the nursing home, seemed bewildered and embarrassed. "I can't believe this is the same place I visited before," she murmured, avoiding eye contact with Margaret. John, on the other hand, appeared concerned and promised to resolve the situation. "Mum, don't worry. We'll make sure this place is up to standard. I'll handle the necessary renovations," he said with determination. However, as days and weeks passed, John's promises faded amidst the busyness of his daily life. And Margaret, with her usual strength, decided not to remind him of his commitments. Instead, she focused on her new life at the nursing home, where, despite the conditions, she found a sense of community and purpose. Margaret began to get involved in the nursing home's activities, contributing her experience and wisdom. She helped other residents, organized small activities, and shared stories of her life. In these acts of service, she found solace and a new form of happiness. "I can make a difference here too," she thought, finding peace in accepting her new reality. In her heart, Margaret knew she had closed an important chapter of her life, but she also understood that every ending is a new beginning. Although leaving her home and the disappointment with her family had been painful, she found a way to move forward, to find light, even in a place that was not what she had expected. The arrival of spring brought not only the rebirth of nature but also significant changes in the lives of Margaret and her family. John and Susan, thinking about the future, decided it was the right time to sell Margaret's house. They saw it as a valuable asset that, if unused, should become an economic benefit for the family. With the kids growing and our needs changing, selling Mom's house seems like the sensible thing to do, John expressed to Susan while reviewing some documents in his study. Susan, agreeing, added, "Yes, and the money from the sale could be a good inheritance for us and the kids. It's practical." Though she had reservations about how Margaret would receive the news, Susan was convinced it was the right decision. When they went to the nursing home to obtain Margaret's signature, they were met with a surprise that shook their plans. The place had been completely renovated with new and vibrant furniture. The walls, painted in light but cheerful tones, brought a sense of peace and tranquility. Margaret, with a mix of pride and defiance, revealed that she had already sold the house. "I used the money to renovate this place. Here. This is where I live now, and I wanted it to be the best it could be for me and the other residents," she explained calmly. Susan's reaction was one of disbelief and anger. "How could you make such an important decision without consulting us? That was our inheritance," she exclaimed, unable to hide her frustration. John, though surprised, tried to mediate the situation. "Mom, we understand you wanted to improve your new home, but you should have told us something," he said, trying to stay calm. Margaret, however, remained firm. "I have made many decisions in my life thinking about others, especially you, John. This time, I decided for myself. Besides, I have always believed that the most valuable inheritance I can leave is the example of a life lived with dignity and generosity, not a sum of money," she responded with serenity. Susan, still furious, struggled to comprehend Margaret's perspective. She felt betrayed by her mother-in-law's unilateral decision and worried about how this would impact her family's financial future. John, on the other hand, began to reflect on his mother's words. Though initially disappointed, he gradually started to understand and respect Margaret's decision. He realized that even in her later years, his mother was imparting a valuable lesson about autonomy and the importance of taking care of oneself and others, beyond material considerations. Margaret's choice to use the money from selling the house to improve her current surroundings was a clear message of independence and strength. Despite the initial shock, John began to admire this deeply. Susan, although initially angry, would eventually have to come to a similar understanding, facing her own priorities and family values. In the modest yet cozy room of the nursing home, Margaret sat opposite John and Susan with a serene expression on her face. Despite the palpable tension in the air, there was a clarity in her eyes that reflected the firmness of her decision. "I've lived a long life, and learned that true independence is invaluable, Margaret began, her voice steady despite her age. I firmly believe that as an adult, and especially in my old age, I have the right to make decisions that directly affect my life. John, a mix of surprise and confusion on his face, tried to interrupt, but Margaret raised her hand to stop him. Let me finish, son. For years, I've devoted myself to our family, and now, in this stage of my life, I need to think about what's best for me. Renovating this place, making it more livable, not only benefits my well-being but also that of many others living here with me. Susan, struggling to contain her frustration, responded, But Margaret, don't you think you should have consulted us? After all, John is your son, and this affects our future too. Margaret looked at Susan with a gaze that combined understanding and sadness. Susan, I understand your concerns, but you also need to understand that this is my life, and I have the right to live it as I see fit. Moreover, freeing John and you from the responsibility of taking care of me is also an act of love. John, feeling a whirlwind of emotions, stood up abruptly. I don't know what to say, Mom. This is unexpected. Susan, equally disturbed, stood up, grabbing John's arm. Without another word, they both left the nursing home, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. In the days and weeks that followed, Margaret felt the absence of their visits. However, she found peace in her decision. She had chosen a path of self-determination and dignity, a path she hoped John and Susan would eventually understand and respect. At the nursing home, Margaret became a respected and beloved figure, a source of wisdom and strength for the other residents. Although the decision had created a distance between her and her family, she had gained a sense of freedom and autonomy that she valued deeply. Margaret's decision to use her resources to improve her current environment, rather than preserving them for an inheritance, reflected her belief in living in the present, with dignity and making meaningful contributions to her immediate community. It was a choice that spoke to her character and her commitment to her own values in the face of misunderstanding and disagreement from her loved ones.